In How Countries Go Broke, the big cycle legendary investor Ray Dalio reveals the hidden patterns that drive the rise and fall of nations. Drawing from decades of research, Dalio shows how debt, inflation, political conflict, and social unrest follow predictable cycles, leading countries from prosperity to crisis and sometimes collapse. In this video from Detailed Book Summaries, we break down the core lessons of Dalio's latest work, giving you the tools to understand not just why countries fail, but how you can prepare for the economic storms ahead. If you want more summaries on finance, history, and strategy, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay ahead of the curve. In How Countries Go Broke, the big cycle legendary investor Ray Dalio uncovers the hidden forces that cause nations to rise, thrive, and ultimately fall. Using decades of historical data and real-world examples, Dalio reveals how debt bubbles, political divides, rising inequality, and unsustainable spending create a repeating cycle, one that has led powerful countries throughout history into crisis and collapse. In this video from Detailed Book Summaries, we'll break down Dalio's big ideas and timeless principles so you can see the patterns shaping the world today, understand what causes countries to go broke, and prepare yourself and your family for the cycles ahead. If you want more deep insights into global finance, economics, and power, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest summaries. Chapter 1. The Beginning of the Cycle: Rebuilding from Collapse. Every great empire begins after a fall. That's the paradox of history that Ray Dalio wants us to understand. When a country seems completely broken, after a war, a depression, a revolution, that's often the moment it's actually poised for its greatest rise. The reason? Collapse clears the slate. It resets the system. And in that rubble, something new and powerful can emerge. This is the beginning of what Dalio calls the big cycle, a recurring pattern that has played out across the centuries, from the Dutch Empire in the 1600s, to the British Empire in the 1800s, to the rise of the United States and more recently China. The big cycle is the story of how countries become powerful, and how they eventually lose it all. At the heart of the big cycle are three major forces: the long-term debt cycle, internal order and disorder, and external order and disorder. These forces move together in waves, shaping the fate of nations. In this chapter, we zoom in on the earliest stage of the cycle, a time of rebuilding, innovation, and rapid productivity growth. After collapse, a nation enters what Dalio calls the rebuilding phase. Trust in the system, whether that's government, currency, or leadership, is often at rock bottom. Debt may have been wiped out through inflation or default. Institutions may have crumbled. But oddly enough, this is what makes the environment ripe for growth. There's nowhere to go but up. In this phase, people are usually united by a shared sense of hardship. They've suffered, and they don't want to repeat the mistakes that led to the downfall. As a result, they tend to value productivity, discipline, education, and saving. There's a national hunger to produce more than is consumed, to export goods, to build infrastructure, and to earn back the trust of the world. And this is exactly what powers the beginning of a great empire. Take the United States in the years after World War II. The country had just emerged from two massive crises, the Great Depression and the war itself. But instead of retreating, it rebuilt, stronger than ever. Massive infrastructure projects like the interstate highway system were launched. Universities expanded. Factories that once produced tanks now churned out automobiles and appliances. At one point, the U.S. held over 50% of the world's gold reserves. It was the undisputed economic leader of the post-war era. Or look at China in the late 20th century. After decades of chaos under Mao's Cultural Revolution, China began its rebuilding phase in the 1980s. The country opened up economically, invested heavily in manufacturing and exports, and made education and savings national priorities. For decades, China grew at breakneck speed, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty and becoming a global powerhouse. These early stages of a country's rise are defined by high levels of productivity and relatively low levels of debt. People work hard. They save more than they spend. Governments are cautious. Currencies are relatively stable. And trust in leadership, in money and institutions begins to slowly rebuild. This is often the golden era of a country. Not always the richest or most glamorous, but the most sustainable. A time when the system is aligned toward growth through real value creation. But here's where the story begins to turn. Because this kind of success carries its own hidden danger. As the country becomes wealthier, people start to spend more. They feel more secure, more entitled. Governments take on more obligations, more social programs, more military spending, more promises. Slowly, debt begins to creep back in. But because things still feel good, no one sounds the alarm. Inequality tends to grow during this time, even if the overall economy is expanding. Those who benefit most from the early productivity boom accumulate wealth rapidly. Those who don't feel increasingly left behind. And as the divide widens, social tensions simmer quietly in the background. Dalio emphasizes that in this phase, borrowing starts to rise, but not for investment. It's used for consumption, for entitlement, for speculation. And because the nation is still trusted globally, it can borrow easily. Foreign investors are still eager to lend. The currency is still seen as stable. But that trust won't last forever. This is where the seeds of decline are planted. During the peak of strength, the country begins to move from a production-based economy to a consumption-based one. From saving to spending. From unity to division. It doesn't happen all at once. But the shift is subtle and it's dangerous. What makes the early phase of the big cycle so powerful? Discipline, hard work, unity starts to fade. Complacency sets in. Politicians chase popularity. Central banks begin printing more money. And over time, the productive engine that drove the early rise of the country begins to slow. Dalio's warning is clear. Most people don't see the transition happen because it takes years, sometimes decades. But history shows that the most dangerous moment for a nation isn't when it's struggling. It's when it starts to believe it can't fall. And so, the big cycle moves on. Chapter 1 is the most hopeful part of the story. It's the time of rebuilding, of collective effort, of trust being restored. But like all great stories, this one has a twist. Because what comes next is a slow, invisible unraveling. In Chapter 2, we'll look at the next phase. Debt, leverage, and the first cracks in the system. A time when things still look good on the surface, but under the hood stress is building. Credit is expanding. Inflation is awakening. And the cracks in the empire are beginning to show. The fall doesn't happen yet. But the foundation is no longer as solid as it seems. Stay tuned. Chapter 2. The first cracks: debt, credit, and the illusion of prosperity. A nation doesn't collapse the moment it makes a mistake. Collapse happens slowly, quietly, often while things still feel good on the surface. And that is the great danger. When the signs of decline are buried under a mountain of comfort, celebration, and borrowed success. After a country emerges from hardship, after it rebuilds through grit, discipline, and productivity, it begins to enjoy the rewards of all that work. This is natural. People are tired of sacrifice. They want rest, comfort, ease, and for a while that's exactly what they get. This is the second stage of what Ray Dalio calls the big cycle, the period after a nation's disciplined rise, where growth becomes increasingly reliant not on hard work or real productivity, but on debt. The machinery of the economy is still running, but now it's running on credit. At first, this seems harmless, even beneficial. Borrowing allows people to buy homes, start businesses, invest in the future. Governments borrow to fund infrastructure, defense, education, social programs. Debt, when used wisely, is a tool for expansion. And in this stage of the cycle, optimism is everywhere. The pain of the past is forgotten. The present feels like a triumph. The future feels secure. But beneath the surface, a quiet imbalance begins to grow. The economy becomes dependent on credit. Not just to grow but to function. Consumers use it to fund lifestyles that outpace their income. Companies use it to inflate their valuations. Governments use it to meet promises they can no longer afford. What was once a helpful tool becomes a habit, then an addiction. The illusion deepens. Asset prices begin to soar. Real estate becomes a speculative goldmine. The stock market surges. Banks and investors pour money into anything that promises yield. People talk about how rich they've become, not from labor, but from watching numbers rise on a screen. Houses become investments. Debt becomes leverage. It all seems to work. Credit becomes cheap and accessible. Central banks, encouraged by the apparent success of the economy, keep interest rates low. Loans are easy to get. Lending standards loosen. Mortgages are handed out with minimal documentation. Credit cards become a way of life. Debt is no longer a concern. It's a lifestyle. The focus shifts from investing to consuming. In the early days of the cycle, credit was used for building factories, roads, productive businesses. But now it's used for buying bigger houses, flashier cars, luxury goods, vacations. The country moves from saving to spending, from discipline to indulgence. And as the rich benefit from the surge in asset prices, inequality quietly grows. Those who own assets, homes, stocks, businesses, see their wealth explode. Those who don't fall behind. They watch as housing becomes unaffordable, as wages stagnate, as their neighbors seem to soar while they struggle. Resentment builds, but it remains hidden for now beneath the surface, behind the headlines of prosperity. To most people, things still seem good. GDP is rising. Employment is steady. The economy is growing. Politicians take credit. Markets cheer. And the average citizen, seeing no reason to worry, joins in. Why not borrow more? Why not spend more? Why not upgrade the car, renovate the house, live a little? But this kind of prosperity is not real. It's borrowed from the future. That's the central insight of this phase. The economy is no longer growing because of increased productivity. It's growing because of increased debt. People, businesses, and governments are spending money they haven't earned yet. And eventually the bill comes due. Ray Dalio emphasizes that Chapter 3. When trust breaks, inflation, devaluation, and the beginning of the fall. Trust. It is the invisible thread holding a nation's economy together. More than gold reserves, more than oil, more than military power. It's trust that keeps the entire machine running. Trust in the currency. Trust in the institutions. Trust in the rules of the game. But once that trust begins to fray, a country doesn't just wobble. It spirals. In this third chapter of the big cycle, we watch the illusion of prosperity begin to crack. We are past the point of debt accumulation. The bills are coming due. And the country, still trying to preserve its comforts and momentum, begins reaching for its last lever, the printing press. It starts quietly, almost invisibly. A little inflation. A few percentage points at first. The central bank tells the public it's transitory. Just part of the cycle, nothing to fear. But that's not true. The inflation isn't the cause, it's the symptom. The real problem is that the country's debt has grown too large to manage through normal means. And instead of addressing it with real reform, the nation takes the shortcut, printing more money to meet its obligations. First it works. The economy stays afloat. The markets stabilize. Pensions get paid. Programs continue. The public breathes a sigh of relief. The crisis seems to have been avoided. But nothing has been solved. The debt remains. Only now it's being repaid with money that is worth less and less. Inflation begins to accelerate. Prices rise faster than wages. Grocery bills double. Rent climbs. Gasoline costs stretch household budgets. People start to notice. They cut back on spending, but no matter how carefully they budget, their money doesn't stretch like it used to. The cost of living crisis becomes real and widespread. And the people begin to lose confidence not just in the economy but in the currency itself. This is the phase where Ray Dalio's insights become brutally clear. When a country begins to print large amounts of money to cover its debts, currency devaluation becomes inevitable. It's not always deliberate. It may not be announced. But it happens. Quietly, steadily, then suddenly. The money loses purchasing power. Foreign investors take notice. They begin to pull out. Why would they hold bonds that pay back in a currency losing value every month? Why would they trust a system where debts are inflated away? Capital flight begins. The currency weakens further. The central bank intervenes, but every intervention costs more credibility. This is the death spiral of trust. And in every country that has gone broke throughout history, from Weimar Germany to Zimbabwe, from Argentina to Venezuela, this is the point where collapse begins. Not with tanks or protests, but with fear. Fear that the money won't be worth anything tomorrow. Fear that the system can't be fixed. Fear that the promises made by the government about security, retirement, savings were built on sand. And when people stop trusting their money, they start acting differently. They buy hard assets, land, gold, foreign currencies, anything that might hold value. They hoard. They speculate. They try to convert their cash before it's worthless. Prices rise not just because of inflation but because of panic buying. Even basic goods begin to vanish from shelves. Markets become unstable. Black markets emerge. And those who saved all their lives in the local currency realize their savings are being erased day by day. And the pressure doesn't stay in the economy, it spills into politics. Leaders face impossible choices. Do they raise interest rates to slow inflation, knowing it could trigger mass unemployment? Do they cut government spending, knowing it could spark outrage? Do they try to stabilize the currency by pegging it to something more trusted, risking a crisis of sovereignty? Most leaders don't have the courage to take the painful road, so they choose the easier one. They print more. They blame others. They change definitions. They censor critics. And the system, once strong and admired, begins to look brittle, erratic, corrupt. The population turns inward. They begin to lose faith in the institutions that once held the country together. The media is no longer trusted. The numbers feel manipulated. The central bank, once boring and technical, is now a political lightning rod. Civil discourse breaks down. People stop thinking in terms of left and right, and begin to think in terms of us and them. Inequality, which had been rising quietly for years, now explodes into public anger. Because inflation is not neutral. It punishes the poor. It erases fixed incomes. It benefits those who own assets, real estate, stocks, art, and crushes those who earn wages. It turns society into a game where the rules favor the few and leave the rest scrambling. And once this reality becomes obvious, people don't just get angry, they get radicalized. And here the next wave begins. As Ray Dalio notes, the breakdown of trust in money almost always leads to internal conflict. Not always open violence, but certainly ideological warfare. Populism rises. Nationalism surges. Political moderation disappears. Every election becomes existential. Every leader is viewed as a savior or a traitor. The middle class, the great stabilizer of society, begins to shrink. People who once believed in slow, steady progress now crave sweeping change, no matter the cost. And all of this happens while the money continues to weaken, while the government prints more, while foreign investors retreat, while the nation's credibility erodes. It's easy to imagine this only happening in failed states or distant countries, but it's happened dozens of times in modern history, and the signs are always the same. Rising debt, political gridlock, printing money to cover the gaps, inflation, currency devaluation, and then disorder. We're not yet at the final stage, but we are close, and the trajectory is clear. A country in this phase has very few tools left. It can default on its debt, either formally or through inflation. It can restructure its financial obligations, hurting creditors and trust. It can peg its currency to another, surrendering monetary sovereignty. Or it can try to reinvent its system, often through painful reform or revolution. But what it cannot do is pretend everything is fine. Because by now, the people no longer believe it. They've seen their savings disappear. They've watched their paychecks shrink in real terms. They've lived through shortages, instability, fear. They've stopped trusting the promises of politicians, the projections of economists, the calm reassurances of talking heads. And when trust in the currency dies, it rarely comes back quickly. Recovery is possible, but it requires deep structural change. A new beginning, new rules, new leadership. Often, it takes a generation to rebuild what was lost in just a few years of excess, denial, and decay. That's the endgame of Chapter 3. It's not just about inflation or interest rates or fiscal policy. It's about what happens when a country burns the bridge of trust and is left standing on a cliff. And as we'll explore in Chapter 4, the next phase of the big cycle brings even greater upheaval. Because what often follows the economic fall is not recovery, but conflict. When internal anger meets external threats, when factions rise, and when nations look outward for someone to blame, the world doesn't just shift. It breaks. Stay with us. Chapter 4. From frustration to fire, internal disorder, external conflict. Every empire, every dominant country, reaches a point in its life cycle when its greatest threat is no longer external but internal. The enemy is not always across the border. Sometimes it's across the street, or across the aisle. And when the internal fabric of a society begins to tear, it rarely does so quietly. This is the fourth chapter of the big cycle, the breakdown of domestic order and the rise of conflict, within and beyond borders. It begins subtly, almost imperceptibly, not with revolutions or rebellions but with discontent. After the inflationary crisis has taken hold, after the currency has lost its footing and the economy has weakened, people begin to look for someone to blame. And they don't look at themselves. They look up, or across, or at whoever represents the other. Ray Dalio calls this the stage of internal disorder. It's when the consequences of economic mismanagement, debt addiction, rising inequality, devalued money, erode social trust. Not just in the currency or the institutions but in each other. The middle class, once the stabilizing backbone of society, is now fractured. Their savings have been diluted. Their jobs feel uncertain. Their children's futures seem smaller than their own pasts. The promises of upward mobility no longer hold. And so, people lose patience. With the system. With their leaders. With each other. Polarization intensifies. Politics, once a contest of ideas, becomes a battle of identities. Left versus right becomes us versus them. Debate turns to accusation. Disagreement turns to rage. And the population begins to split, not just ideologically but geographically, generationally, racially, economically. Cities against rural areas. Old against young. Workers against the wealthy. Citizens against Chapter 5: The Fall and the Reset. When systems break and begin again, no one sees the exact moment a nation falls. There's no siren, no grand announcement. Often when the collapse finally arrives, it feels both sudden and long overdue, like a dam that held until the very last crack gave way. What follows is not chaos in the abstract, but a deep and painful reckoning. A reckoning with reality, with history, and with choices made long before the collapse became visible. This is the fifth phase of the big cycle. The fall and the reset. And it's where everything changes. By now, the country has exhausted its levers. It has printed its way through a debt crisis. It has suffered inflation, currency devaluation, internal division, and rising external pressure. The social contract has frayed. Institutions have lost legitimacy. The political system is gridlocked or radicalized. People are angry, exhausted, and unmoored. The once confident empire or dominant nation is now adrift and vulnerable. And then something breaks. Sometimes it's a debt default, a declaration that the government can no longer repay what it owes. This could be external debt owed to other nations, or internal obligations like pensions and benefits. Either way, the promise is broken, and with it, trust vanishes completely. Sometimes it's a currency collapse, a free fall in the value of money that renders savings worthless, upends trade, and forces the country into emergency mode. Basic imports become unaffordable. Supermarkets empty. Barter returns. And the people who once lived in relative stability are now scrambling just to survive. Sometimes it's a governmental breakdown, a failed election, a coup, a revolution, or simply a total erosion of function. The military may step in. A populist strongman may rise. Civil institutions may shut down. Chaos may spill into violence. It looks different in each country, but the result is the same. The old system can no longer carry the weight of the crisis it created. Ray Dalio calls this the big bust phase. It's not just a recession or a downturn. It's a structural collapse, the clearing out of a system that has grown dysfunctional, bloated, and brittle over decades. The old model of debt-fueled growth, unbalanced power, overpromised welfare, and short-term politics finally gives way. But here's the paradox. This collapse, as painful as it is, can be the beginning of renewal. Because in the ruins of the fall, a reset becomes possible. This reset does not come easily. It is almost always forced. It involves mass suffering. But it clears the ground for something new. A new monetary system. A new political alignment. A new set of rules. This is where new leadership sometimes emerges. People or groups who are not part of the old elite, who speak to the pain of the masses, who offer not a return to the past but a reinvention of the future. They may come from outside politics, or they may be forged in the fire of the collapse itself, but they carry the seeds of the next cycle. Dalio emphasizes that these resets tend to follow a consistent path. Debt is wiped out or drastically restructured, currencies are replaced or pegged to hard assets, Social programs are redesigned or reduced, and power shifts, either to a new internal coalition or to external rivals who now hold the upper hand. This process is not pretty. It often includes national humiliation. The country may lose its place on the global stage. Its institutions may be rebuilt from scratch. Its people may suffer years, even decades, of lowered living standards. But what makes this stage so crucial is that it contains the first honest reckoning with reality in a long time. No more illusions of infinite borrowing. No more pretending that money can be printed without consequence. No more empty political promises or unchecked consumption. The system hits bottom, and only then can it begin to rebuild on more stable, sustainable foundations. In this moment, the past becomes a warning. Leaders and citizens must ask hard questions. How did we get here? What did we ignore? What values did we abandon? What choices brought us to the edge? And how do we avoid repeating them? This is where education matters. History matters. Institutions, if they still exist, must be rebuilt with integrity. And the people, if they are to trust again, must be shown that sacrifice is not in vain. Ray Dalio offers this perspective not to inspire fear, but awareness. Because the cycle is predictable. The fall is not random. It follows years of buildup, excess, denial, and drift. But if understood, if the signs are seen early, then the reset can be less catastrophic, and perhaps even transformative. He points out that some nations have managed resets well. After World War II, Germany and Japan were reduced to rubble, but with outside help, visionary leadership, and clear planning, they rebuilt stronger and more stable than before. The U.S. after the Great Depression saw massive institutional reform. The New Deal, Social Security, a new financial system. Pain was necessary, but it didn't end in collapse. It ended in reinvention. The reset, when embraced with clarity and humility, becomes the foundation of the next rise. But if it's resisted, if elites cling to power, if the public stays divided, if denial persists, then the fall drags on. Recovery is delayed, and sometimes never comes. That's the choice every nation faces in the fifth phase of the big cycle. The fall is unavoidable once the excesses have compounded. But what follows, the kind of reset that emerges, depends on how a country confronts the truth. Whether it learns, whether it rebuilds, whether it chooses renewal over revenge, wisdom over rage, and structure over sentiment. This is the point where history diverges. Some nations fall and never rise again. Others rise anew, wiser, leaner, and more durable than before. And so the cycle turns once more. As we step into Chapter 6, we will see what it takes to start rising again, how countries can rebuild their economies, restore credibility, and lay the groundwork for a new age of prosperity, if they're willing to do the hardest work of all, changing not just their policies but their principles. Stay with us. Chapter 6. The Quiet Rise, Rebuilding After Collapse. When a country falls, the world doesn't stop. Markets move on. Empires fade. But within the fallen nation, something remarkable often begins. Not loudly, not with parades or fanfare, but with small, often invisible steps. This is the sixth phase of the big cycle. After the crash, after the collapse, after the reset, comes the quiet rise. Rebuilding is not glorious. It is not fast. And it does not begin with a bold speech. It begins with humility. After the fall, a nation finds itself exposed. Its flaws are no longer hidden by wealth or power. Its leaders, if still standing, have lost credibility. Its institutions, weakened or destroyed, no longer function as they once did. And its people, burned by inflation, drained by conflict, or traumatized by failure, approach the future not with confidence but with caution. But this, ironically, is the beginning of strength. Because what follows collapse is often a rare and precious moment. A return to reality. There is no more room for fantasy, for denial, for ideological purity. The country is forced to live within its means. The monetary system must be rebuilt on something solid. Budgets must be balanced. Trust must be earned, not demanded. And slowly, over years, the foundations of a more resilient society are laid down, brick by brick. Ray Dalio emphasizes that the early stages of a new rise are marked by hard money, discipline, and pragmatism. The government, having destroyed its credibility through hyperinflation or debt default, now needs to prove it can be trusted again. It may peg its new currency to gold, or adopt a foreign currency temporarily. It may invite foreign investors and subject itself to tough international oversight. Central banks are rebuilt with mandates for real stability, not political convenience. These decisions are not popular, but they are necessary. At the same time, economic policies shift from handouts to productivity. Subsidies that once masked inefficiencies are stripped away. People are forced to work, to innovate, to compete. This causes pain, but it also forces adaptation. Incomes begin to reflect value creation, not state generosity. And over time, the economy becomes more productive, not just larger. In the best cases, new leadership emerges, not from the old elite, but from technocrats, businesspeople, or reformers who understand that legitimacy can only be earned through results. These leaders don't promise miracles. They promise discipline, stability, and rule of law. And if they deliver, even slowly, the nation begins to trust again. Dalio points to historical examples where the quiet rise was not just possible, it was transformative. After World War II, West Germany lay in ruins. Its cities were bombed, its currency worthless, its economy paralyzed. But with the help of the Marshall Plan and the leadership of figures like Ludwig Erhard, Germany restructured its economy around industrial productivity, stable currency, and export-led growth. Within a decade, it became one of the world's fastest-growing economies. The United States after the Great Depression offers another lesson. It took the shock of 25% unemployment, mass bank failures, and widespread. This is the chapter of quiet discipline, of national humility, of institutions that work even when no one is watching. And it is precisely this quiet rebuilding that sets the stage for the next ascent. The moment when a once broken nation can stand tall again. Takes time. It takes resolve. And it takes the courage to say no to short-term temptations, so that the long-term rise can be sustained. In Chapter 7, we'll explore what that sustained rise looks like, how countries go from recovery to global leadership, from rebuilding to dominance, and how the seeds of future decline are already planted, even at the peak. Because every rise, no matter how noble or necessary, carries within it the risk of overreach. But for now, in this chapter of history, we pause to recognize the quiet rise is not the loudest chapter, but it might be the most important. Chapter 7. The high prosperity, power, and the seeds of decline. There comes a moment, quiet at first, then unmistakable, when a country realizes it is no longer in recovery. It is no longer simply rebuilding. It is rising. The wounds of collapse have scarred over. The economy hums with life. Trust, once shattered, has returned. The people begin to feel proud again. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the nation moves from humility to confidence, from survival to strength. This is the high. Ray Dalio describes this phase as the top of the big cycle. The years or decades when a country enjoys real prosperity. Not speculative bubbles, not borrowed wealth, but sustainable productive success. The currency is strong. Employment is high. Innovation flourishes. The world respects its laws, trusts its institutions, and looks to its leadership. It is, in short, a golden era. And yet, within this golden era, the first shadows appear. To understand why, we have to step back. The high is born from the sacrifices of the previous era. Tight fiscal policies, careful investment, structural reform. Those who remember the collapse run the system with caution. They know what happens when excess runs unchecked. They are guided not by entitlement, but by responsibility. And for a while, this restraint powers a remarkable ascent. But success changes things. As prosperity spreads, expectations shift. A new generation grows up without memory of inflation, war, or collapse. They see only growth, comfort, opportunity. And so they ask for more. More benefits, more consumption, more credit. They are not reckless, they are simply untested. They assume the good times are normal, permanent, deserved. Meanwhile, the institutions, once rebuilt with discipline, begin to drift. Not all at once, not visibly, but slowly, subtly. Interest groups grow more powerful. Regulations multiply. Bureaucracies bloat. Political parties lose their reformist urgency. The incentives begin to tilt from long-term thinking to short-term gain. Elected leaders start spending not to solve but to please. Externally, the country's rise makes waves. Others watch its ascent with admiration or fear. Competitors emerge. Alliances are tested. And as the leading power grows confident in its dominance, it may begin to act with increasing assertiveness abroad. It builds up its military. It projects influence. It protects its trade interests aggressively. It plays the role of global hegemon. This too at first feels justified. After all, its economy is the largest. Its currency is the most trusted. Its cultural influence is unrivaled. And yet, as Dalio warns, this is the most dangerous moment in the cycle. Because at the height of strength, nations often forget how fragile power really is. The economy may still be growing, but now debt is creeping back in. Not for survival, but for comfort. Households take on more credit. Corporations leverage up. The government runs deficits even in good times, assuming growth will always cover the cost. The central bank becomes more reactive, less willing to make hard calls that might upset markets or voters. Inequality grows, because in prosperous times those with capital gain faster than those with labor. Asset prices rise, wages lag, and slowly resentment builds beneath the surface. Social unity once forged in hardship begins to erode. Identity politics rise. Tribalism returns. The shared purpose that carried the nation through collapse and into renewal starts to fray. People turn inward, distrusting institutions, questioning fairness, and seeking simple answers to complex problems. This is how the seeds of decline are planted, not during collapse, but at the very peak of success. Dalio points to many empires that followed this arc. The Dutch Empire, once dominant in trade and finance, succumbed to complacency and internal division as wealth piled up. The British Empire, after a century of industrial might, began to stretch itself too thin militarily and financially. The Roman Empire fell not in war, but in moral decay, excess, and political dysfunction that made it vulnerable to external threats it once easily repelled. The United States, too, Dalio warns, has followed this pattern. After World War II, it stood unchallenged economically, militarily, culturally. The dollar became the global reserve. American institutions set the tone for the post-war order. But by the 1970s, debt had risen, social conflict intensified, and the dollar was decoupled from gold, signaling a shift from hard to soft money. Even today, beneath surface-level growth, the patterns of overspending, division, and institutional erosion are familiar to any student of cycles. And so, the high becomes a paradox. It is the most prosperous phase, but also the most vulnerable. Because it is when discipline fades, when entitlement grows, when the lessons of the past are forgotten, and when leaders begin to trade long-term stability for short-term applause. So what then can be done? Can the high be extended? Can a country rise without falling? Dalio is cautious. History suggests that some degree of decline is inevitable, that the internal forces set in motion during prosperity will eventually lead to a period of correction. But decline doesn't have to mean collapse. And collapse doesn't have to mean the end. The key, he argues, is self-awareness. If a nation at the height of its power can remain humble, if it can maintain strong institutions, sound money, fiscal responsibility, and social cohesion, if it can educate its people not just in skills but in historical context, then the cycle can be stretched, the fall softened, and the next phase entered with preparation rather than panic. That's the work of leadership. And not just political leadership, but civic, intellectual, financial, and generational leadership. Those who understand the cycle must speak up when excess begins to rise. They must remind the nation that power is not a right. It is a privilege earned and easily lost. Because the high, for all its beauty, carries within it the blueprint for decline. And the story is not over. In the next chapter, we will begin to see how decline takes shape, not as a sudden event but as a slow erosion. A shift in tone. A series of small decisions that, over time, pull the nation downward. We will explore the next turn in the cycle, the descent from dominance, and what it means for the world when the center can no longer hold. But for now we sit at the peak. And if history has taught us anything, it is this. The top is not the safest place. It is the moment when a country must choose between protecting the long arc of its future or indulging in the comfort of its success. One leads to legacy, the other to repetition. Chapter 8. The slow descent: debt, division, and denial. Decline does not announce itself. It does not knock on the door and say, "Your time is up." It doesn't begin with a war, a market crash, or a revolution. Those are merely symptoms of something deeper. Real decline, the kind that changes the course of a nation, begins slowly, almost invisibly, with habits, with attitudes, with choices made not in crisis but in comfort. This is the 8th stage of the big cycle, and in many ways the most insidious, because it hides behind prosperity. It cloaks itself in the language of strength and optimism, even as the foundations begin to weaken. It tells a country that the good times will go on forever, just as the rot begins to spread beneath the surface. Ray Dalio explains that the descent begins when the discipline that built the rise starts to fade. In the aftermath of a long high, people grow used to abundance. Institutions become comfortable. Leaders grow reactive. And slowly the focus shifts, from long-term investment to short-term consumption, from national unity to factional interest, from hard-earned wealth to debt-fueled illusion. Debt plays a central role here. In the rising phase, debt was used productively to build, to invest, to grow. But in the descent, it becomes a tool for maintaining appearances. Governments begin running larger deficits not to spark growth, but to delay pain. Interest payments eat a growing share of tax revenue. Instead of reducing obligations in good times, they expand them, because politically, austerity is unpopular, and reform requires courage that few possess once power is stable. As public debt swells, private debt follows. Consumers borrow more to maintain lifestyles that are no longer supported by real wage growth. Corporations leverage up, buying back stock rather than building durable businesses. The financial system becomes more fragile, not because it is visibly broken, but because no one wants to be the adult in the room. Dalio warns that in this phase, the currency often starts to wobble. At first, it holds because faith in the institutions remains. But as fiscal irresponsibility grows, and as the central bank is increasingly used to finance deficits or smooth over downturns, confidence in the money itself begins to fray. Inflation may creep in, not always sharply at first, but steadily. And the response? Often denial. Leaders downplay it. Policymakers insist it's transitory. The public, unsure who to trust, either tunes out or turns angry. And underneath it all, the question grows louder. What happens if this house of cards comes down? Meanwhile, social divisions begin to harden. The inequalities that deepened during the high, when asset prices soared and wages lagged, now ignite resentment. The wealthy are seen as out of touch. The poor feel abandoned. The middle class feels squeezed, working more but gaining less. Trust in institutions, already strained, starts to erode more visibly. People question whether the system is still fair, or whether it's rigged. And so politics becomes more polarized. The center weakens. Extremes rise. Left and right no longer debate policy. They question each other's legitimacy. Conspiracy theories flourish. The media becomes a battleground, not a bridge. And the idea of a shared national identity, the very glue that held things together during past hardships, begins to dissolve. Dalio observes that this isn't unique to any one country. It happened in the late Roman Empire, where corruption, excess, and social division made it vulnerable to outside forces. It happened in pre-revolutionary France, where aristocratic privilege and national debt collided with growing unrest. And in 20th century Britain, as the empire shrank, debt soared and industrial decay set in, political gridlock and labor unrest paralyzed reform. The signs are always the same. A declining share of global trade, rising internal conflict, growing populism, weakening institutions, and a loss of economic dynamism. In this phase, the international environment becomes less forgiving. Rivals, once junior partners, begin to assert themselves. They see opportunity in the incumbents' complacency. They gain market share, invest in innovation, and challenge the established rules. Meanwhile, the declining power grows defensive. It tightens control. It clings to the old order, even as it becomes harder to sustain. At this point, Dalio warns, many nations begin to overreach abroad while decaying at home. Military budgets stay high. Foreign commitments expand. Diplomatic tone grows more assertive, even as the domestic political system weakens. This is a dangerous combination. The world sees power, but it also sees fragility. Internally, leaders often choose narratives over solutions. They promise to restore greatness without addressing the structural weaknesses. They blame external enemies, immigrants, or ideological opponents. Real reform becomes politically toxic. And so, the descent accelerates not because the country is weak but because it refuses to admit it is vulnerable. One of the clearest signs of this stage, Dalio says, is the breakdown of cooperation. Within politics, between social classes and across institutions, the trust that once allowed for sacrifice, higher taxes, spending cuts, structural changes disappears. Instead, everyone fights for their piece of the shrinking pie. This leads to gridlock and ultimately to institutional failure. Courts lose legitimacy. Elections are contested. The central bank is politicized. The military may be dragged into domestic issues. And the economy, no longer supported by a shared vision or long-term thinking, begins to stagnate or spiral into instability. At this point, the decline becomes visible to everyone. Bond yields rise. Credit ratings fall. Foreign investors pull back. The currency weakens rapidly. Inflation, once dismissed, becomes a household worry. Civil unrest increases. And the global community begins to quietly prepare for a world where this once dominant nation is no longer in control. Dalio does not say this descent is inevitable, but he emphasizes that it is natural, predictable, even when nations forget what made them strong in the first place. The path to decline is not a single event. It is a series of missed opportunities, ignored warnings, and self-inflicted wounds. And so the question is not whether the cycle turns, but whether a nation has the will to face itself, to recognize that strength is not permanent, that institutions must be maintained, that unity must be cultivated, and that the future is not secured by past glory, but by present clarity. In the final chapters, Dalio will explore how this descent ends, sometimes in reset, sometimes in collapse, sometimes in reinvention. But for now, we remain in this fragile space between power and peril, between success and self-destruction. The lights are still on. The buildings still stand. But under the surface, the descent has begun. Chapter 9: The Crash, Collapse, Conflict, and the Reckoning. There is a moment in the life of a nation when the cracks, once hairline then widening, become fractures. The illusions can no longer be sustained. The debt that was once manageable becomes crushing. The promises made in confidence can no longer be kept. And the society, already divided and cynical, begins to unravel. This is not just decline. This is the crash. Ray Dalio calls this the final phase of the downward arc, the moment when all the pressures that had been quietly building for years, sometimes decades, suddenly erupt. Like a dam giving way, it doesn't happen all at once, but when it does, it's swift, brutal, and nearly impossible to stop. It often begins with a loss of faith in the currency, in the leadership, in the system itself. Investors pull out. Credit dries up. Inflation spirals out of control, or deflation suffocates spending. The central bank, now politicized and reactive, either prints too much or tightens too late. The value of money disintegrates. And when money fails, everything built upon it begins to collapse. Governments are forced to make impossible decisions. Raise taxes, cut benefits, default on obligations. Each path leads to social unrest, political violence, or economic pain. And often they choose the fourth option, printing money. But this, as Dalio points out, only buys time while worsening the core illness. A lack of productivity, trust, and fiscal responsibility. Hyperinflation is the most obvious symptom of this final stage. It happened in Weimar Germany, where a loaf of bread costs billions of marks. It happened in Zimbabwe. It happened in Venezuela. And it has happened dozens of times throughout history. People rush to spend their salaries the moment they receive them, because the money will be worth less tomorrow. The idea of saving vanishes. Foreign currency becomes a lifeline. Bartering returns. The economy descends into chaos. But not all crashes involve hyperinflation. Some involve sovereign default, when a nation can no longer pay its debts and simply stops trying. Argentina has done this multiple times. Russia did it in 1998. Greece came close in the 2010s. The result is the same. Creditors flee, bond markets freeze, imports stall, and the population suffers. Foreign powers step in, not always altruistically, with bailouts or terms that strip the nation of autonomy. Internally, social and political chaos accelerates. Protests turn violent. Strikes shut down services. Crime spikes. In some cases, coups occur. In others, populists rise on the left or right, promising salvation through radical change, redistribution, protectionism, nationalism, or authoritarianism. And in desperate times, the people listen. Because faith in democratic compromise has vanished. Dalio reminds us that civil war is not always fought with weapons. Sometimes it's fought in courts, in legislatures, in streets, in algorithms. The battle isn't always for land. It's for legitimacy, for control of narratives, for the future. And while this internal collapse plays out, the world watches and adjusts. The declining empire loses credibility. Its military power remains, but the will to use it weakens. Allies begin to hedge their bets. Rivals grow bolder. A new power may rise to fill the vacuum. The old hegemon is no longer trusted to lead the international system. Its currency is abandoned in favor of more stable alternatives. Either another nation's currency or, increasingly, hard assets like gold, real estate, or decentralized digital stores of value. In these moments, Dalio emphasizes the global order itself often breaks. Trade alliances dissolve. Global institutions lose authority. The rules of engagement change. There may be war, either outright or economic. There may be fragmentation. What was once a relatively stable and predictable world becomes fractured, tribal, and dangerous. And yet, amid the wreckage, something unexpected begins to stir. Because a crash, while devastating, is also clarifying. It strips away delusions. It reveals what was weak and unsustainable. The forces change, not because people want it, but because they have no other choice. Dalio describes this as the beginning of the reset. Not yet recovery, but the painful birth of a new cycle. In the wake of a crash, people rediscover the value of things they had forgotten. Productivity over speculation. Hard money over soft promises. Unity over tribalism. Integrity over popularity. The generation that rises from the ashes has no illusions. They are not entitled. They are tested. And slowly they begin to rebuild. This has happened again and again. After the crash of Rome, came the long reordering of Europe. After Weimar Germany, came both the horror of fascism and, eventually, the order of post-war reconstruction. After the Great Depression in America, came the regulatory reforms, institutions, and norms that stabilized the mid-20th century. After every collapse, if a society survives, it is given the chance to learn, to do better. But this rebirth is never guaranteed. It depends on how deeply the society can reflect, on how willing it is to examine not just what went wrong, but why it allowed itself to follow the same historical script. Dalio's central message here is sobering but not hopeless. The crash is not an anomaly. It is a natural, predictable part of the cycle. But the extent of the damage and the shape of the recovery depend on what choices are made in its aftermath. Will leaders seek to blame or to build? Will the people demand accountability or revenge? Will institutions be reformed or replaced by force? Will there be justice or merely vengeance? These are the moral questions that emerge when the economic questions fail. And how a nation answers them determines whether it begins a new upward cycle or locks itself into generational decline. As this chapter closes, Dalio turns to us, readers, citizens, observers, and asks, do we recognize the signs? Do we see the patterns? Are we still in denial, or are we preparing to act differently this time? Because history does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. And we are now living in one of those rhymes. What happens next depends not on fate, but on awareness and courage. Chapter 10: Reset, Rebuilding After Collapse. After the storm, silence. After the riots, a stillness hangs in the air, heavy with exhaustion. Markets have crashed, institutions have fractured, trust has evaporated, and yet life goes on. People wake up. They still need food, work, meaning. The collapse has stripped away the excess, the illusion, the borrowed time. And what remains is what has always remained when empires fall: the question of what to build next. In this final stage of the big cycle, Ray Dalio turns our attention not to the crash itself, but to what comes after it, the reset. It is the phase where survivors, bruised and disillusioned, must look at the wreckage and begin again. This is where the possibility of real change, even rebirth, lives. Dalio makes it clear. A reset is not simply a return to the past. It is not a reboot of what failed. It is a restructuring of institutions, of values, of systems, and of assumptions. In some countries, this reset comes through a deliberate national reckoning. In others, it's more chaotic, a scramble to cobble something together out of what still functions. But always it begins with debt restructuring. When the economy has imploded, When the government is bankrupt and inflation or default has decimated savings, the first step is to acknowledge the financial reality. Debts are written off or heavily renegotiated. Pensions are trimmed. Entitlements are reduced. Sometimes new currencies are introduced stronger, more tightly managed, backed by credibility that must be rebuilt inch by inch. Dalio notes that countries that recover best are those that face the truth early and comprehensively. They don't pretend. They don't paper over the past with slogans. They open the books, take the pain, and move forward. History shows that nations that restructure their debt cleanly, reestablish fiscal discipline, and rebuild public trust can regain strength far faster than those that try to delay or deny. Next comes the rebuilding of trust. Not just between people and markets, but between people and each other. When a society has endured crisis, when it has lived through conflict or collapse, the damage is not just economic. It is emotional. Social capital is depleted. People are wary, cynical, and tired. So reform begins not only with money, but with restoring institutional integrity. That might mean a new constitution, as seen after major regime changes. It might mean independent central banks with clearly defined limits and roles. It often means aggressive anti-corruption campaigns, reforms in judicial systems, and transparent governance. The goal is simple but profound. Convince people that the game is no longer rigged. Productivity becomes the lifeline. Dalio emphasizes that in this new phase, countries that thrive focus relentlessly on real economic output, not financial manipulation. Investment flows back into infrastructure, manufacturing, innovation. Education systems are repaired. Trade is reopened, but cautiously, with a focus on internal strength first. Instead of speculative growth, the economy pivots toward fundamentals: goods, services, exports, discipline. The culture shifts too. After every major collapse, Dalio observes, the next generation tends to be far more sober, more grounded. The children of chaos do not grow up with illusions. They value hard work, thrift, competence. They remember what happens when systems are abused and institutions decay. As a result, the early decades of a new upward cycle are often marked by a quiet sense of rebuilding. Stronger institutions, sounder money, better governance. And this is perhaps the greatest irony of the big cycle. The same country that once seemed irredeemably broken can, within a generation, become admired again if it learns. Japan rose from the ashes of defeat to become an economic superpower. Germany rebuilt after both world wars to lead Europe. South Korea, devastated in the 1950s, became one of the most advanced economies in the world. These resurgences were not accidental. They were driven by painful resets that forced clarity, humility, and purpose. However, Dalio cautions that not all countries recover. Some get stuck in decline for decades or even permanently. Why? Because they never fully complete the reset. They let corruption linger. They avoid hard reforms. They continue printing money or blaming scapegoats. They prioritize political survival over economic health. In these nations, the reset fails and the cycle does not rise again. Another key ingredient to a successful reset is leadership, not just in government but across society. In past rebounds, visionary yet pragmatic leaders emerged who could unify fractured populations. These were not idealists but realists with moral authority. They didn't promise quick fixes. They offered honesty, shared sacrifice, and a clear path forward. They made people believe again, not in magic but in effort. Dalio also stresses the importance of global positioning during the reset. While the fallen power resets, a new global order is often already taking shape. The nation must decide. Will it resist this shift and cling to old dominance, or will it find its new place within the emerging balance? Those who adapt, who trade, partner, and focus inward while respecting outward realities, recover faster. Those who posture, threaten, or retreat into isolation often wither further. Finally, the reset phase gives rise to a new ideology or narrative. This is where national identity is redefined. It may be rooted in pragmatism, innovation, or shared suffering. Whatever it is, this new narrative becomes the fuel for the next generation's rise. It binds the wounds and sets the vision, and so the cycle begins again. The debt has been cleared. The excesses have been punished. The divisions, though still present, are no longer fatal. A new generation steps forward, not with naive optimism, but with earned wisdom. Dalio closes this chapter, and the big cycle itself, by reminding us that the arc of national success is never straight. It bends. It loops. It breaks. But it is always within our power to understand where we are, why we got here, and what comes next. The reset is not just a phase of history, it is an opportunity. If understood and used wisely, it can be because while history may feel chaotic when you live it, Dalio shows us it is deeply cyclical when studied across time. Empires rise, they flourish, they overextend, they decline, and they collapse, over and over again. And yet, most people and most leaders fail to see it coming. Why? Because they look at symptoms, not structures. Because they confuse short-term noise for long-term signals. Because they're inside the system, emotionally and financially entangled. So this chapter is about pulling back. About stepping outside of one's moment in time to observe the deeper mechanics at work. Dalio calls this developing a big-picture lens. And that lens, he argues, is not optional. It is essential for anyone trying to protect or build wealth, govern wisely, or even just understand the world as it is. He begins with a simple but powerful truth. Economies and empires are ruled by cycles, not by linear progress. What goes up does not keep going up. What falls eventually finds bottom. And every rise and fall is driven by a mix of debt, productivity, internal order, and external strength. Understanding the balance or imbalance between these forces reveals where a nation stands in the cycle. One of the most crucial tools Dalio gives us here is the concept of early indicators. These are the subtle signals that most people ignore, but that almost always precede the storm. Rising debt relative to income, widening wealth gaps, a loss of productivity growth, an erosion of trust in institutions, political polarization that leads to dysfunction rather than compromise. These signals don't cause collapse overnight, but they point to a society drifting out of alignment. If you want to know where your country stands in the cycle, ask, are the divisions getting wider or narrower? Is debt being used to invest in the future, or to pay for the past? Are the rules being followed or bent for political gain? Are the most productive people being empowered or punished? These are not abstract questions. They are the pulse checks of a nation. Dalio notes that most citizens and even policymakers live in a kind of cycle denial. They assume that the good times will stretch endlessly forward. They see rising asset prices and think it reflects strength, not leverage. They see political movements and think they are isolated, not structural. But history tells a different story. History shows that ignoring the cycle is one of the most expensive mistakes a country, or a person, can make. And so, he urges readers to learn pattern recognition, to study not just their own nation's history, but the rises and falls of many nations across centuries: Rome, China, the Ottomans, the Dutch, the British, the Americans. Different cultures, different technologies, same dynamics. In all these cases, the seeds of decline were planted during the height of success. It was during the boom that the debts accumulated, during peace that the military declined, during abundance that discipline eroded. And by the time the symptoms were visible to all, it was often too late to prevent the correction. But this chapter is not just about spotting decline. It's also about what to do when you recognize it. If you are a policymaker, the answer is structural reform. Tighten fiscal policy, reduce unproductive debt, invest in education and innovation, rebuild trust in institutions, and protect the rule of law. These are not politically easy, but they are economically essential. If you are an investor or business leader, Dalio advises you to diversify across countries, currencies, and asset classes. The goal isn't to guess the future, but to reduce your vulnerability to extreme scenarios. Study the fundamentals. Watch the central bank actions. Pay attention to where capital is flowing and where it's fleeing. And if you are simply a citizen, an observer trying to make sense of your place in the world, Dalio urges self-education and historical awareness. Understand the structure you live in. Know its strengths but also its fragilities. Don't place blind faith in any one system or ideology. And most importantly, be alert when people in power begin rewriting the rules or demonizing others to avoid accountability. The final insight in this chapter is perhaps the most personal. Cycles are not destiny, but denial is. If we recognize where we are, we gain power. We can adapt. We can prepare. We can, in some cases, even redirect the arc. Because the purpose of understanding the big cycle is not to become cynical or fatalistic, it is to become wise. To gain the kind of long-term perspective that can calm fear, strengthen action, and inspire better decisions. Dalio closes this chapter with a challenge. How many times must history repeat before we listen? He reminds us that the tools exist, the patterns are visible, the stories are written, and the cycles, while powerful, are not mysterious. They are built from choices, individual, collective, economic, and moral. If we study them, if we learn from them, we can break the habit of blindness that has doomed so many great societies before. And perhaps for once we might turn the wheel not because we had to, but because we chose to. Chapter 12. The Personal Cycle: How to Apply These Lessons to Your Own Life and Finances. The patterns that shape the rise and fall of nations are not confined to flags or governments or stock markets. They live in households. They echo in personal decisions, ripple through relationships, and manifest in our everyday lives in ways most people never realize. In this final chapter, Ray Dalio turns the lens from countries to individuals, showing that the big cycle is not just a historical theory, it's a personal roadmap. Just as countries go broke through a mix of overconfidence, short-term thinking, and unsustainable debt, so do people. And just as nations recover through painful resets, renewed discipline, and clarity of purpose, so can individuals. Dalio believes that if you truly understand the cycle, you can spot its fingerprints in your own financial habits, career decisions, emotional patterns, even your worldview. The real power of the big cycle isn't just geopolitical insight, it's personal transformation. He begins by drawing a clear parallel. Individuals, like nations, often experience three major phases: growth, excess, and correction. During the early years of growth, you're investing, learning, building. You're hungry. You live below your means. You focus on improving productivity, skills, discipline, networks, and resilience. This stage mirrors the early rise of a nation, when innovation, order, and sacrifice drive real advancement. Then, often subtly, excess begins to creep in. As income grows, so do spending habits. Ambition becomes entitlement. Debt, once a strategic tool, becomes a crutch. Many individuals, Dalio observes, begin borrowing not to invest in their future, but to finance their lifestyle. The fundamentals weaken. The hunger is gone. And slowly, though the surface may still look successful, the structure is degrading. It's no different from the imperial phase of a nation that stops innovating and starts consuming itself. Eventually, something breaks. A job is lost. Markets turn. Illness strikes. Or perhaps the truth just becomes too loud to ignore. And now you're in the correction phase, personally, emotionally, financially. You downsize. You cut spending. You ask harder questions. If you're wise, you pause and reflect. And that's where the opportunity lives. Dalio argues that just as countries must reset through hard choices and transparency, individuals must face their own numbers. You look at your balance sheet. You calculate what you actually own and what you owe. You stop pretending, and you decide, will I rebuild on a firmer foundation, or will I try to paper over the cracks again? For most, the reset is not just economic, it's psychological. The experience of personal financial failure often forces people to confront their assumptions about success, safety, and even self-worth. But here Dalio offers something rare: hope with structure. He insists that the best personal growth often happens after financial pain. Why? Because pain forces humility. It strips away illusion. It makes room for new learning. So what then does a personal rebound look like? Much like a national one, it begins with honest accounting, not just of your finances but your habits. Are you living on borrowed time? Are you taking on obligations that your future self might not be able to carry? Are you measuring success by things that don't actually compound over time? Dalio encourages a shift away from lifestyle inflation and toward asset growth and skill development. Real wealth, he explains, isn't what you consume. It's what you retain and reinvest. Whether you're 25 or 60, the core principle is the same. Spend less than you earn, save aggressively, invest wisely, and know your cycle. But more than saving, Dalio emphasizes diversification. Financially, emotionally, and intellectually. Don't rely on one job, one income stream, or one worldview. Don't let your identity get tied to a single role or status. Just as investors hedge across asset classes and countries, resilient individuals hedge across relationships, skills, and opportunities. He also introduces a subtle but powerful idea: the concept of your own internal central bank. Just as nations have institutions to stabilize crises and guide monetary policy, you need a system to handle emotional volatility. When fear spikes, whether due to job loss, global events, or personal crisis, how do you react? Do you panic and make impulsive decisions? Or do you have internal tools, a policy framework, that brings clarity and calm? This isn't just about stoicism or emotional intelligence. It's about personal governance, managing your mind and behavior the way a great central bank manages currency, with credibility, discipline, and flexibility. In times of chaos, your internal governance may be the most valuable asset you own. Dalio also reminds readers that cycles are different for everyone. Just because the world is in a boom doesn't mean your life is. And just because the world is in decline doesn't mean you can't grow. Your goal isn't to escape the cycle. It's to ride it well, to know where you are in it, and to respond accordingly. That's what wisdom looks like. In fact, some of the most successful people Dalio has studied didn't avoid failure. They learned how to convert failure into strategy. They treated setbacks like data. They treated pain as a signal, not a sentence. And most importantly, they stayed in the game long enough to reap the compounding returns of growth, learning, and discipline. As he closes this chapter and the book, Dalio urges readers to live like students of cycles. Not just global cycles but personal ones. Track your own emotional booms and busts. Study the cause and effect in your finances. Ask what kind of empire you are quietly building through your habits, your values, and your daily choices. Because in the end, every great national rise begins with individual discipline. And every national collapse begins with personal delusion. The tools are the same. The lessons repeat. If you understand how countries go broke, you'll understand how people go broke. If you understand how nations recover, you'll see the blueprint for your own rebound. And if you study the big cycle closely enough, it may not just teach you about the fate of empires, but about how to live a more conscious, resilient, and meaningful life inside one. That is the real principle beneath all others. Cycles govern systems. But choice governs you. And it's never too late to choose differently. Chapter 13, The Role of Leadership, Navigating the Cycle with, or Without Wisdom. In every great rise and fall of nations, one element remains consistently pivotal: leadership. More than policy, more than institutions, more than even natural resources or location, it is the quality of leadership during key moments of transition that determines whether a country adapts, declines, or collapses entirely. In this chapter, Dalio turns his attention to the often overlooked human factor in the big cycle. Who is steering the ship when the tide begins to turn? At first glance, it may seem obvious that good leadership matters. But Dalio takes it further. He shows that great leadership is not just about intelligence, charisma, or even experience. It's about understanding the cycle. The best leaders in both politics and economics are not merely reactive. They are pattern literate. They recognize when the rules are shifting beneath their feet. They know how to act with principle when incentives are distorted. And they resist the twin poisons that often accompany decline: short-term thinking and tribalism. History is littered with examples. When Rome began to falter under its own weight, the emperors who accelerated its fall were those who prioritized popularity over policy, spectacle over structure. They printed more currency, fed the people bread and circuses, and ignored the growing rot in the economy and the military. In contrast, during the Dutch Golden Age, leadership emphasized innovation, fiscal prudence, and global trade expansion. Until, of course, the nation's later leaders abandoned those values for war, debt, and complacency. The same can be said of modern powers. As Dalio shows through his comparative studies of the British and American cycles, what separates eras of resilience from eras of collapse is rarely ideology. It's almost always the willingness of leaders to face reality and act early. The most dangerous kind of leader is not the corrupt one, nor even the authoritarian one, but the one who is blind to the structural forces at work, or worse, the one who understands the cycle but pretends not to for political survival. Dalio explains that as nations move deeper into the late stages of a cycle, when debt is high, productivity is flat, inequality is rampant, and polarization is intensifying, the cost of poor leadership grows exponentially. Small errors in judgment become national crises. Policy missteps trigger global ripple effects. And trust, once lost, is almost impossible to rebuild. At that stage, the role of leadership is no longer about guiding growth. It is about managing pain and restoring credibility. The mark of great leadership in late-stage cycles is not how much comfort it provides, but how much clarity. The ability to communicate hard truths, to reduce complexity without oversimplifying, and to maintain order without repressing dissent is rare. Dalio points to Franklin D. Roosevelt as an example of this delicate balancing act. During the Great Depression and the pre-World War II years, both clear late-stage cycle moments, Roosevelt introduced structural reforms, preserved democratic institutions, and rebuilt public trust without collapsing under populist pressure. He didn't eliminate the pain. He gave the pain meaning. In contrast, Dalio highlights more recent examples where leaders either ignored the structural imbalances or chose to exploit them. Whether in the form of reckless monetary policy, partisan brinkmanship, or the erosion of central bank independence, these moves deepen the fragility of the system. And once faith in leadership evaporates, it is usually replaced not with reform, but with rage. This is why leadership during a decline phase must possess moral courage. It must think generationally, not politically. It must resist the instinct to delay consequences through debt expansion or currency debasement. And it must tell the truth about the nation's position in the cycle, not as a tool of fear, but as a call to collective maturity. Dalio also discusses the importance of institutional leadership, central banks, courts, regulatory bodies, and their role in either supporting or sabotaging national stability. When these institutions remain impartial, transparent, and focused on long-term sustainability, they provide ballast to the political chaos. But when they become politicized or lose their independence, they accelerate the loss of trust. It's no coincidence that in every empire's fall, institutional decay precedes social collapse. But what happens when strong leadership is absent? When the helm is empty or worse, corrupted? Dalio doesn't shy away from this grim scenario. He explains that in such cases, nations often default to instinctual survival mechanisms: nationalism, protectionism, and repression. These short-term strategies may provide temporary relief or political rallying points, but they rarely fix the underlying imbalances. In fact, they usually exacerbate them. However, Dalio leaves space for hope. He reminds us that leaders are not born. They are shaped by their understanding of history, economics, and human behavior. That means better leadership is possible, even probable, if societies choose to cultivate it. Education, transparency, and incentives that reward long-term decision-making can produce leaders who see beyond the election cycle. He also notes that great leadership isn't always found at the top. Sometimes it emerges locally, through mayors, business leaders, educators, or investors who decide to think cyclically and act accordingly. In fact, Dalio argues that in fragmented societies where national leadership is dysfunctional, regional or private leadership may carry the torch of adaptation. At its core, this chapter is a meditation on responsibility, not just political but civic. If we know where we are in the cycle, if we understand what is coming, then we have a duty to support the kind of leadership that can guide us through it. That means resisting simplistic answers. It means choosing discipline over dopamine. And it means rewarding those who speak with clarity rather than comfort. Because in the end, the fate of a nation isn't sealed by its currency or its military. It's sealed by the character of those who lead when it matters most. As the cycle crests and begins its descent, as the pressures mount and the choices grow heavier, leadership becomes not just important, but existential. Dalio finishes this chapter with a sharp reminder. We cannot always control the stage of the cycle we are born into. But we can control how we show up in it, what we support, what we demand, and what kind of example we set. If the cycle is the current, leadership is the oar. And while we may not be able to stop the wave, we can decide how we ride it, or if we crash beneath it. Chapter 14: Technology, Innovation, and the Cycle of Productivity. At the heart of every enduring empire, beneath its flags, armies, and political systems, lies something less visible but infinitely more powerful: productivity. And at the core of productivity is innovation, new ways of doing things, of solving problems, of extracting more value from fewer resources. In this chapter, Ray Dalio unpacks how technology and innovation drive the rise of nations, shape their prime, and when neglected or mismanaged, signal their decline. In the early phases of the big cycle, after a country has emerged from war, depression, or chaos, it typically enters a period marked by rebuilding, reinvention, and invention. Innovation is not optional, it's survival. Resources are scarce, needs are great, and the only path forward is through increases in productivity. This is when the most profound technological and industrial breakthroughs tend to occur, not because society is wealthy, but because it is hungry. Dalio points to post-World War II America as a prime example. In the decades that followed, the U.S. became a global hub for scientific research, engineering innovation, and industrial productivity. These breakthroughs, ranging from aerospace to computing, did not merely increase GDP, they reshaped the global economy and cemented America's role at the center of the post-war order. But what matters even more than the technologies themselves, Dalio argues, is the mindset that produces them. A national culture that rewards curiosity, tolerates failure, and reinvests in the future. This phase of technological expansion is typically accompanied by rising living standards, falling costs per unit of output, and growing real wages, especially when productivity gains are broadly shared. Innovation acts as a tailwind. It doesn't eliminate economic problems, but it makes them more manageable. Debt burdens shrink relative to output. Growth becomes less dependent on credit and more rooted in efficiency. However, as the cycle progresses into its middle and late stages, a quiet shift begins. Innovation, once driven by necessity and vision, often becomes captured by incumbency and short-term profit motives. The energy that once flowed into high-risk research begins to migrate toward financial engineering, stock buybacks, and asset speculation. In other words, capital starts chasing returns, not breakthroughs. Dalio warns that this is where many leading nations make a critical mistake. They mistake past innovation for permanent advantage. They assume that just because they led the last technological wave, they'll naturally lead the next one. But history doesn't reward entitlement. The British Empire once dominated steam and steel, only to be outpaced by American electrification and assembly line manufacturing. Later, the US led in computing and the internet, but is now challenged by rapid advances coming out of China in artificial intelligence, green energy, and digital infrastructure. What determines who leads the next wave of innovation, Dalio explains, is not just money but structure. Nations that fund education, protect intellectual property, foster immigration of top talent, and encourage entrepreneurial risk-taking tend to stay ahead. Those that overregulate, underinvest in public research, or allow monopolies to stagnate the market tend to fall behind. The invisible hand can only build what the visible institutions make possible. But productivity doesn't just rise and fall with technology. It also moves with how innovation is distributed. If the gains of new tech are concentrated in the hands of a few firms or regions, social friction intensifies. Inequality rises. Political division deepens. In this sense, innovation can become a double-edged sword. It may boost aggregate output while simultaneously eroding trust and social cohesion. The productivity gains are real, but their benefits are uneven. And if left unaddressed, that inequality can sow the very seeds of populism and instability that begin to unravel the gains. Dalio doesn't suggest abandoning technology to protect stability. He suggests that how a society integrates and governs innovation is what determines whether technology fuels a new golden age or a disjointed, unstable one. The internet, for example, brought about immense efficiencies, but also fractured attention, weakened institutions, and enabled misinformation at scale. AI, now emerging as a general-purpose technology, holds immense promise, but also terrifying power to amplify existing imbalances in power and productivity. In response to this tension, Dalio outlines a few core principles. First, invest in foundational education, not just job training but critical thinking, science, and historical perspective. Second, maintain a robust system of public-private research partnerships, allowing the state to de-risk early-stage discovery, while allowing the market to scale solutions. Third, reform incentive structures, so that long-term R&D isn't constantly sacrificed for quarterly returns. And finally, ensure that the fruits of innovation are widely shared, through both wage growth and ownership structures, such as employee equity participation or broad-based stock access. Importantly, Dalio cautions against confusing activity with progress. A nation can appear busy launching new apps, growing GDP, expanding consumption, while actually experiencing a slow erosion of deep productivity. True innovation increases the output per unit of labor and capital. It doesn't just shift spending around, it expands capacity. When a country's brightest minds are focused on arbitrage, advertising, or speculative finance, rather than on energy, infrastructure, medicine, or education, the innovation engine may still be humming, but it's no longer building a durable future. And yet, Dalio remains optimistic. He believes that technological revolutions can reset cycles, even amid decline, if a society is willing to make hard choices. When the right leadership aligns with the right innovation environment, and the population is educated, unified, and forward-facing, it's possible to escape stagnation and begin a new cycle of ascent. We've seen this before. The United States in the 1940s, Germany and Japan in the 1950s, South Korea in the 1980s, China in the early 2000s. All these nations leveraged technology not just for economic growth, but for national renewal. They understood that the long-term health of a nation lies in what it produces, not just what it consumes. And they invested accordingly. Dalio ends this chapter with a quiet but urgent warning. If a leading power loses its edge in innovation, or worse, suppresses it through fear, complacency, or bureaucracy, it begins a slow decline that no amount of financial stimulus can fully mask. Productivity is the engine of prosperity, and innovation is the fuel. When that fuel runs dry, when a nation no longer bets on its builders, inventors, and dreamers, it begins to consume its past instead of creating its future. And that, more than any single event, is how great powers fade. Chapter 15: Globalization, Fragmentation, and the New World Order. The rise and fall of empires have never occurred in a vacuum. No country, no matter how powerful, escapes the gravitational pull of the global system it exists within. In this chapter, Ray Dalio turns his lens toward the interconnected world, examining how globalization and fragmentation shape the trajectory of nations, and how the tension between the two often signals the birth of a new world order, or the chaos that precedes it. In the early stages of the big cycle, globalization tends to flourish. After major wars or collapses, countries are exhausted by conflict and eager to rebuild. Trust is low but necessity is high. This shared desperation often leads to cooperation, new trade relationships, international institutions, and agreements on rules governing commerce, currency, and capital. Dalio points to the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 as a prime example. The war-torn world came together to build a monetary system anchored in the US dollar, creating decades of relative stability and growth. During this phase, nations open their economies, flows of trade and capital accelerate, and productivity rises as specialization takes hold. Countries that were once enemies become economic partners. The logic is simple. Trade promotes peace, and peace enables prosperity. As supply chains stretch across continents, as money moves freely, and as corporations become multinational giants, the world becomes deeply interconnected, financially, technologically, and culturally. But Dalio warns that this global harmony is fragile, and it doesn't last forever. As the leading power ages and its advantages decline, relative challengers begin to rise. The very openness that globalization requires starts to feel threatening to those whose position is slipping. Nations that once championed free trade begin to erect barriers, often under the banner of protecting national security or restoring sovereignty. This marks the beginning of the fragmentation phase, a predictable but dangerous pivot in the cycle. In Dalio's framework, fragmentation begins subtly. First, there are trade skirmishes, tariff disputes, accusations of currency manipulation. Then, as trust erodes, alliances weaken. Supply chains are shortened or reshored. Capital becomes more cautious, and economic interdependence turns into geopolitical vulnerability. The cooperation that once fueled prosperity now feels like a trap. One of the clearest contemporary examples, Dalio notes, is the growing rift between the United States and China. What began as a symbiotic economic relationship, China manufacturing goods for the West, the U.S. providing capital and consumption, has slowly turned adversarial. Both powers are now engaged in economic decoupling, racing to reduce their reliance on each other in everything from semiconductors to rare earth minerals to digital infrastructure. This is not an anomaly, it is a feature of the late-cycle dynamic. Dalio explains that this shift toward fragmentation doesn't mean globalization disappears. It means it reorganizes. New blocs emerge. Smaller alliances form. Trade continues, but it becomes increasingly regional, strategic, and politicized. The dollar-based financial system, which underpinned the last global era, comes under stress as alternative systems, such as China's yuan clearing networks or BRICS-backed initiatives, begin to challenge its dominance. These developments have profound consequences. Capital flows become more volatile. Markets become more exposed to geopolitical shocks. Energy, technology, and currency become tools of foreign policy, not just economic inputs. And as the world becomes less cooperative, conflict becomes more likely, not always in the form of war, but in sanctions, cyber attacks, proxy battles, and diplomatic standoffs. But why does this matter for how countries go broke? Dalio is clear. Fragmentation accelerates decline. For aging powers, the loss of global trust means the erosion of privileges they once took for granted, chief among them reserve currency status. When countries and corporations no longer feel safe holding your debt or conducting trade in your currency, financing deficits becomes harder, borrowing costs rise, and monetary sovereignty erodes. At the same time, fragmentation weakens the feedback loops that help correct imbalances. In a globalized system, capital and talent move toward efficiency. In a fragmented world, decisions are driven by fear and politics. That makes misallocations more frequent, corrections more painful, and cooperation harder just when it's needed most. Dalio doesn't claim fragmentation is inherently bad. He acknowledges that globalization has downsides. It can hollow out industries, concentrate wealth, and create strategic vulnerabilities. But he argues that when fragmentation is driven by fear rather than vision, it tends to spiral. Each side views the other's defensive moves as offensive. Rhetoric escalates. Diplomatic channels close. And eventually a new order must be born, often through conflict. This is the heart of Dalio's insight. The transition between world orders is never smooth. The last few centuries have shown that major shifts in global power, whether from the Dutch to the British or the British to the Americans, are almost always accompanied by major financial and military disruptions. The emerging power tries to assert its influence. The incumbent power tries to defend its position. The result is often not just fragmentation, but outright confrontation. And yet, amid the tension, there is opportunity. For countries that understand where they are in the cycle, and how the global landscape is shifting, fragmentation offers a chance to rethink dependencies, diversify partnerships, and invest in resilience. It's a time for strategic clarity, not nostalgic clinging to the past. Dalio points to the countries that adapted to previous shifts, Germany after the Cold War, South Korea after the Asian crisis, as examples of how smart policy, innovation, and regional alignment can create new strength even in a fractured world. In closing, Dalio emphasizes that we are living through one of those pivotal transitions right now. The post-World War II American-led order is fraying. A multipolar world is emerging. The institutions, alliances, and currencies that defined the last cycle are being questioned, and, in some cases, actively replaced. Whether this leads to coordinated renewal or chaotic realignment will depend on how well nations understand the pattern and how wisely they act within it. Because when globalization fades and fragmentation rises, a nation can no longer float on the strength of the system. It must navigate on its own strategically, clearly, and courageously. This is not the end of the world, Dalio writes, but it is likely the end of the world as we knew it. Chapter 16. The archetype of collapse, when the center can no longer hold. Collapse does not begin with a bang. It begins with fraying. The outer edges pull away. Trust weakens. Institutions bend under the weight of complexity, and eventually they break. In this pivotal chapter, Ray Dalio explores the final and most sobering phase of the big cycle. The moment when a country, once dominant and prosperous, reaches the point where the center can no longer hold. Every empire, no matter how mighty, has a limit to how much internal stress it can absorb. Dalio observes that collapse is rarely caused by a single shock. Instead, it's the cumulative effect of multiple reinforcing breakdowns, economic, social, political, and international. When these pressures converge, and when leaders are either too fragmented or too late to respond, the system begins to unravel from the inside out. One of the first signs of collapse, he writes, is the breakdown of trust in institutions. In the early stages of decline, Citizens lose faith in their government's ability to manage the economy. But as collapse nears, that mistrust spreads further, to the courts, the police, the media, and even the currency itself. Laws no longer feel fair. Elections no longer feel legitimate. News no longer feels real. In a functioning society, the center holds because people believe in something bigger than themselves. But in a collapsing one, self-interest replaces shared interest, and every institution becomes a battlefield. Economically, this phase is marked by a rapid loss of monetary control. Governments that have borrowed heavily during earlier stages, especially when growth was slowing, now face the full consequences. Dalio explains that as debt burdens become unmanageable, and as the central bank resorts to printing money to meet obligations, the result is often a steep rise in inflation or currency devaluation. First, this is gradual, but once confidence is lost, the slide accelerates. Domestic holders rush into hard assets. Foreign investors exit entirely. Prices rise, wages can't keep up, and everyday survival becomes more pressing than any macroeconomic policy. Meanwhile, the social contract disintegrates. Populations already burdened by inequality now face shortages, rising costs, and failing services. Protests become common, sometimes violent. Populist leaders emerge from both the left and right, offering simple solutions to complex problems and stoking anger toward scapegoats: immigrants, elites, foreign powers, minorities. Dalio notes that once the public stops believing the system can be reformed, it begins to look for someone who promises to burn it down. This is also the point where governance paralysis sets in. Polarization isn't just a political problem, it becomes a systemic threat. Legislatures grind to a halt. Budgets can't be passed. Leaders can't agree on priorities. Often, one side of the political spectrum calls for austerity and the defense of tradition, while the other demands redistribution and radical reform. Both are convinced the other poses an existential threat to the nation. Cooperation becomes treason. Every election feels like a last stand. Dalio warns that at this stage, a peaceful middle ground becomes nearly impossible to maintain. In the international arena, the world watches nervously. Allies begin to hedge their bets. Adversaries seize opportunities. In past collapses, from the fall of Rome to the crumbling of the Soviet Union, external threats often pile on once internal unity falters. Borders weaken. Military readiness declines. Diplomatic influence shrinks. And because the collapsing power no longer inspires confidence, even long-standing partners begin to drift away. But Dalio is careful to emphasize that collapse is not a sudden act. It is a process. There are windows for recovery even late in the cycle. Some nations pull back from the brink. They enact painful but necessary reforms, create coalitions to stabilize governance, restructure debt, and reinvest in institutional legitimacy. But this requires one thing above all: a unified recognition of the crisis and a willingness to endure short-term sacrifice for long-term survival. If that consensus can't be reached, the process accelerates into free fall. Historically, Dalio shows full-scale collapse often culminates in some form of regime change. This could be a revolution, a military coup, a breakdown into regional authorities, or a fundamental rewrite of the nation's constitution or currency system. What replaces the old order is rarely clear at first, and often more fragile than the system it displaced. But from that rubble, a new cycle begins. The country is forced to rebuild. Debts are wiped out. Institutions are reimagined. And eventually, if the nation survives, it enters a new phase of rebuilding, sometimes humbler, sometimes wiser, but always changed. In this late stage, Dalio returns to his core theme. Human nature doesn't change, but systems must. The same patterns repeat because the incentives, fears, and desires that shape nations are universal. The challenge is whether a nation can recognize its place in the cycle early enough to act wisely. That's why he doesn't write this chapter with pessimism, but with urgency. Collapse is not inevitable, it is predictable. And what is predictable can be mitigated. He closes with a warning. When the center no longer holds, when trust evaporates and fear takes its place, the greatest risk is not from enemies outside. It is from the fractures within. The house falls not because of a storm, but because its foundation has rotted. And in that moment there are only two paths left: renewal through truth and discipline, or ruin through denial and delay. The question for any nation nearing this stage is not whether it is in decline. The question is, does it still have the will and the wisdom to pull itself back from the edge? Chapter 17. The Blueprint for Navigating the Next Collapse. When a nation begins to crack under the pressure of debt, division, and disorder, the instinct is to panic or to deny. But Ray Dalio argues that there is another path: understanding. This final chapter is not a prediction of doom, but a blueprint for preparation. It asks not only what happens when a country goes broke, but more importantly, how can individuals, institutions, and governments navigate that descent without being destroyed by it? Dalio begins with a grounding principle. History is the best guide we have. Every cycle, no matter how unique the context, follows a set of familiar stages. And because the forces driving collapse are structural, not moral, they can be anticipated. The goal, then, is not to prevent the end of a cycle. That's impossible. The goal is to position oneself wisely within it, to adapt early, act intelligently, and emerge stronger on the other side. The first step in the blueprint is brutal honesty about where a country stands. Too many leaders, Dalio writes, cling to the illusion of exceptionalism, the belief that their nation is different, immune to decline, protected by past glories or sheer scale. But cycles don't care about pride. They respond to debt burdens, internal conflict, weakening productivity, and lost trust. And when those metrics start flashing red, pretending otherwise only delays the reckoning. So what should be done? The answer begins with fiscal discipline and monetary realism. In the late stage of decline, governments often rely on short-term fixes, borrowing more, printing more, spending more, to paper over structural weaknesses. These tactics feel like solutions, but they are accelerants. They deepen the imbalances and erode confidence. Dalio stresses that the real path to stability requires acknowledging the unsustainable nature of existing debt and designing plans to reduce it, either through restructuring, austerity, or reallocation. Painful? Absolutely. But less painful than waiting for markets or inflation to impose those corrections by force. Next, Dalio turns to the importance of rebuilding institutional trust. At the brink of collapse, institutions lose legitimacy because they've stopped serving broad interests. Bureaucracies become self-protective, courts politicized, media fragmented, and elections combative. To survive the transition, a country must do the hard work of restoring transparency, fairness, and competence in governance. That means revising rules, enforcing accountability, and giving citizens reasons to believe that the system, though imperfect, is capable of reform. Without trust, no policy will hold. With it, almost any challenge can be faced. A critical part of this blueprint also involves managing internal conflict with clarity and compassion. As inequality rises and cultural divides harden, countries enter periods of escalating tension. The temptation is always to silence dissent, punish opponents, or double down on ideological purity. Dalio warns this only accelerates fragmentation. The wiser path is to seek national unity not through forced consensus, but through renewed common purpose. That means investing in education, opportunity, and public health, not just to grow GDP, but to grow the sense of shared fate. A nation that feels like it's breaking apart will resist any sacrifice. A nation that feels like it's still worth saving will endure far more than most expect. And then there's the external front. In a multipolar world where empires rise and fall side by side, international alignment becomes a strategic necessity. Dalio urges declining powers to accept the reality of shifting influence. The instinct may be to defend hegemony at all costs, to treat every rival as a threat. But that is a losing game. Instead, countries should seek alliances based on mutual respect, deepen regional cooperation, and remain pragmatically engaged with rising powers. Isolation is seductive, but often suicidal. Dalio also speaks directly to investors, business leaders, and everyday citizens. For them, the blueprint is different but no less vital. He advises diversification, not just across assets, but across geographies, currencies, and systems. Do not anchor your entire future to a single economy or political order, he writes. Understand the cycle. Look for signals: accelerating debt, rising populism, currency volatility, institutional distrust. When these align, it's time to hedge. Time to seek safety not in promises, but in resilience. Productive assets, flexible income, strong networks, and adaptive mindsets.